Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Hennon. Joined with Greg Fernandez Jr. today. We also have a special guest, Ann, joining us. Her name is Ann. The three of us will go over some of the response on the movie A Gray State. This is a documentary directed by Erik Nelson that is finishing its rounds on the film festival circuit, and Greg and I have not seen it. We were both in it, and then Ann did end up. She's from the Minneapolis, Twin Cities, Minneapolis-St. Paul area. She did attend the screening and jotted down some notes, and she'll be joining us today. Greg, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm doing great.
Good. And welcome, Ann. Are you with us?
I am.
Oh, very good, very good. And so I think that we haven't had a discussion on this yet, but just for the listeners out there, David Crowley spent a bunch of time making the movie, I think it's called The Gray State, and then there was a documentary that he and his team made called The Gray State, The Rise, and now this is a documentary after the deaths of the family, directed by Erik Nelson. It's called A Gray State. Now this is just a documentary, 93 minutes, and it'll be premiering here. It'll be coming out, I guess, in the theaters in November. But so far, it has been in several film festivals: the Tribeca Film Festival, Melbourne, Nantucket, Greenwich International Film Festival, the St. Louis Film Fest, Milwaukee Film Festival, the Walker Art Center, which was a free screening that included a Q&A afterwards, and that is what Ann attended here last month in September in Minneapolis. And then I think a couple weeks ago was the Downtown Film Festival of LA. This coming weekend is the Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival in Arkansas. And then also in October is the Twin Cities Film Fest. And then this film will be coming out as a theatrical release in November. And well, it'll go from there. So, and I see you took some notes and you attended this. Can you give us some overview of some of your notes here, and we'll kind of chime in, Greg, if you can think of anything as we go. What was your feel and the ambiance and the demographic when you went in to go to that free screening? Ann?
You had some people who are fans of the Walker Art Center and attend the film. You had people from the community who were just interested. And then you had a mix of students and Gray State fans. The film series that they were presenting that included a Gray State documentary was to show films with the pressing issues of our times and the urgent issues that are presented by documentary filmmakers. So they showed the film screening first, and then afterwards was the Q&A. And I was taking notes throughout the film, so I pretty much accurately captured what happened in the movie as it happened. One of the interesting aspects of the movie was the amount of laughter in the audience when they were reacting to the film. Erik Nelson admitted during Q&A that the audience laughed more during the screening in Minneapolis than any other time when the film was shown. Now, I don't think the audience was laughing at the death of the Crowley family or trying to be insensitive. I think they were, basically, I think the film was, at some points, that Erik was trying to make it seem intense or trying to make David look psycho, and they were just enjoying his sense of humor, or maybe they were laughing at the film itself, but I don't
Excuse me, Ann, and this is Dan. I was just sorry to interrupt there, but did you say laughing?
They were laughing throughout the film quite a lot, actually, and I don't think they were laughing at the death of the Crowley family. I think they were laughing at the way Erik put the film together. There was one example I can give you. There was a home movie footage that David captured, and Ronnie was sitting on a chair outside on the deck, and she had a wooden stick in her hand, and Paleo was at the other end of the stick pulling on it. And you can kind of hear David saying off the cuff, you know, somebody may lose an eye over this, and I maybe the unfortunate thing is I may be the one to clean it up. And it was interesting because the audience laughed. They thought, I guess, David was making some kind of humorous joke. But Erik Nelson's response was to say, I can't believe the audience was laughing. This footage was where I was convinced David was a sadist. He was basically trying to tell us that David would have really let his daughter lose an eye or her play get out of control. But that's not how the audience perceived the event at all. And a gray state, basically, it starts out with people close to Kamal and David, some of their friends, their family, a commander he worked with in the service, describing what they knew of the family from the time David was probably a late teenager towards the end. And it was a kind of a pieced-together narrative showing how David had violent fantasies his whole life and went psychotic, basically, and murdered his family. It also portrayed, and it didn't say directly, but it insinuated that David had abused his daughter, Ronnie, and it insinuated also that when he involved children in the filming of Gray State, that was wrong, and he was subjecting these children to violence. And it was kind of insinuating that this is the kind of person he was. He cared more about himself than other people around him. And it also portrayed David as being controlling and abusive towards Kamal. But interesting enough, there really hasn't been any direct evidence that he was abusive. There are, events that family and friends maybe couldn't explain or didn't understand. But the way the film was put together, it didn't give you any answers either. The other thing that was interesting about A Gray State was that it did not mention at all the rise, and it did not mention any of the forensic evidence or police investigative reporting. It just relied on emotion to carry the story, and I didn't find it credible at all. I felt there was a lot of places where the film either contradicted itself or didn't tell the whole story. The biggest area I felt was questionable was Erik Nelson wants you to believe David is psychotic. His psychosis and violent fantasies are what led David to create Gray State. It doesn't mention that Gray State was very thoroughly researched, and David's research included current events. David Crawley made a video on YouTube explaining and going into detail the depths of the research he made, and the video was like 45 minutes long. He was very educated. This wasn't just a film made out of his mind. It also did not explain that David's views in Gray State and in the Rise were things that his friends had talked about a lot with him. I mean, there are other people questioning and having these very same kinds of interests as him. So it's not like he just invented this. And many of these ideas in the movie were actually fed to him and encouraged by his friends. I mean, the other part of the movie I didn't find credible at all was when it showed a clip of Dan and Greg, and it was a very, very short clip, and it was pieced together, and it said that you guys are citizen reporters, and it showed a small clip of Greg saying, "I don't give a crap about credibility," and the audience laughed at that a lot. You guys are portrayed as being conspiracy theorists, of not being open-minded or accepting to other theories, and basically the insinuation is that you guys are both nutcases. I didn't find that credible because it didn't explain or elaborate on your views and why you have your views. It just had 2-minute segment, then it skipped to the next thing. And actually in the description of A Gray State that's promoting it in the Walker, that I'm looking for now, that line from Greg was in here. I'm find it here. And it's just like, I don't believe, if he has a theory and he wants to present his evidence, that's one thing. But his movie shouldn't be based on casting other people in a false light and not including all the information. I feel like he was duping the audience. Why not give the audience all the information and let them decide for themselves?
When we're talking about the line, the whole, I don't give a crap about my credibility, was it prefaced by anything, or was it followed up by anything?
No, it was just thrown in there, and it showed a video of Dan and then you filming in what looked like your home.
Did she drop off?
Yeah, I think so.
I was going to ask her a question. Maybe she'll. I was going to ask her a question. It sounds to me like the way she's explaining it is almost like this documentary is a biography about David Crowley, and that's not neither right or wrong, but the impression I got was that Erik Nelson was going to put this documentary together as a kind of an investigative piece to kind of close the loose ends on this investigation from a police and detective point of view, and bring us into it as well. I know that the group spent.
She's actually back on, so if you want to.
I am back.
Okay, I was just going to ask Ann before you cut off is the impression I got when they were making or putting together this documentary is that Erik Nelson wanted to get a investigative look, kind of at the case, the investigation of the killings for the documentary, but instead it sounds more like a biography done on David Crowley, kind of his life and his background and kind of all these things that led him down this rabbit hole. And it doesn't really sound like the movie focuses much on the investigation, but just kind of his dwindling final days from a psychotic person or something like that. Is that what you?
Yeah.
It's kind of a biography on David versus going into the reasons that the killings took place from an investigative or a forensic standpoint. So that's kind of odd, I guess, for myself, to understand.
Well, it was interesting too. It was, if you could call it, I don't know if you could actually call it it was biography on David. It was biography through the perspective of he's a deeply disturbed, abnormal individual. I felt like the family and the friends who were talking were very honest and sincere, but I also felt they were being exploited because I don't feel that their words and their memories were actually being presented. I felt like everything was being presented to push this psychotic narrative of David.
Yeah, the other thing is, I know when the film crew was here, they spent, it was probably well over 2 hours, probably 3 hours at my home, and I think they were interviewing Greg as well for many hours. So we had lots of questions and lots of on-air time giving our thoughts and ideas and stuff. So not much of that aired, just a little small snippet of it aired on the actual documentary.
Just one line from both of you, and it was made to make you guys both look like you were conspiracy theorists and that you were insane.
What a waste. They spent a lot of money on that.
Wow, that was a lot of time. It was an entire afternoon that, they spent looking for insight and ideas and things like that. And, and I spent a lot of time with talking on the investigative, on the forensic sides of things that did not add up. Certain, basic things on elementary items that a base level detective should have found and should have noted that were discrepancies. And I thought they were going to kind of take the ball and run with it on that. And then, Greg, you can probably add more to this, but I remember distinctly when that comment came up about your credibility, that was in response to someone from the Gray State Project who, in fact, told you to stop talking about the case because it may wreck your credibility. And I think that's when you responded by saying, I'm not worried about my credibility. I'm more worried about getting the truth out. And but it looks like that Erik Nelson perhaps cherry-picked some of our a couple snippets of our lowest moments and kind of spin us in a bad light to discredit us as well.
Well, they did ask me a lot about Sean Wright. I mean, a lot. There was a heavy focus on him. They were looking for different quotes. I felt like they were fishing for certain quotes. And okay, so there is that quote, because I can tell you that quote was taken out of context, because if it doesn't preface the conversation I had with Sean Wright, that's where that quote came from. But then if they're doing that same thing to the family, they're probably misquoting everybody in this movie. So it's kind of hard to look at this movie as a credible movie. So.
Wow.
I actually have my brochure from the Walker where it references that line, and I can read you exactly what it says.
Yes,
It says
please.
here, although several self-identified, quote, citizen investigators attempted to prove that the family was murdered, quote, credibility means nothing to me, one of them ironically comments, the film makes its case methodically and persuasively.
Do they touch on the documentary on the widespread use of social media and how much attention this has gained on social media, how big this case is? Or do they just portray it as Greg and I are the two strange oddballs?
I didn't mention anything about social media, and in fact, I felt like the film was trying to make people on social media turn against David. It had at one point a clip in there stating that David was deleting comments from Facebook. I don't know, and then it had a line basically stating from one of his friends that the people leaving comments were beasts or something like that. But if you weren't listening carefully, it could be portrayed as an attacking remark, like he didn't care about his fans. And then there's also points in the film that made it sound like David just wanted to walk away from the film and be done with it, and it was too much pressure, but that doesn't match like that final letter that he wrote in December and how he's excited to move with the project, and doesn't match how he was excited to release The Rise. I mean, there were so many contradictions and unanswered questions in this film.
Did it touch on the Alam family down in Texas, how they switched and pulled away their cell phone numbers and required David to get his own cell number and things like that, and how the media kind of spun that as to David and Kamel were pulling themselves away and secluding themselves when that was certainly not the case? And does it get into the legal aspect or the attorney that was involved from David, where he was attempting to pull out Danny August Mason from the project altogether, and then he never heard back from him? That was heavily weighing on David's mind in those last days. And a good friend of his, I think at one time he may have even referred to him as his best friend, who had turned on him, and he needed legal help to break the ties. That's pretty serious stuff in the final months of your life, and around the same time when the police should be looking for a motive, motive, and opportunity, when I don't think that was ever even explored. Anything like that, or the mother dying months after the case, anything to that effect?
Well, Erik Nelson basically said he interviewed Cedra Alam and Mr. Alam, but that they didn't want to be part of the film, and then he also said he failed to get a signed release from them, so he couldn't use any footage he showed of them, which I, again, have a problem with.
He didn't get a signed release?
Yeah, apparently he did not get a signed release.
Well, in my case, and Greg, you could back this up if you want, before they even made efforts to come out here with the film crew, I had to have that signed release already done before they even set up the interview. So that's the very first thing that they do before they even start scheduling interviews. So I don't know if I would believe that from Erik Nelson, because they would have already had all that done for the interviews. I'm guessing that later on down the road, the Alam family says, "No thanks, I no longer want to be part of this," and then retracted it later. because there's no way they would have gone and done interviews without having that paperwork in hand. So I'll bet they retracted it after the fact. Is that how Erik Nelson portrayed it in the Q&A?
He kind of brushed over the retracted. He made it sound like, oops, I just forgot to send a release. No, my bad.
That he just forgot to get the signed release? Well, we know that's not the case because, there's no way. Greg, was that an important part for your interview as well?
I mean, they definitely wanted it, but there really wasn't a whole lot to what I signed. So, so for them to say that, we didn't get it or whatever, the fact that the Lom family did not want to be part of this movie should also raise a lot of questions. That also adds to the lack of credibility of this film, because here you have a key people that all seem to say that David Crowley is guilty. Why would they back out of this movie? That's a huge, huge deal. Huge.
So Ann, just to confirm, they were at one point in it, and then they never made the final cut of the movie, is what you're saying. They were interviewed, right?
They were interviewed, and he also said that he had access to some of David's computers and electronic information, but he did not have access to anything from Kamal, and that her computer, he said he couldn't access the computer because of a password issue, so he only had from David's side and then what his friends were saying.
Well, that may be correct, because from what we heard from Officer Gummert, from the lead detective, is that they also couldn't access her Microsoft Surface Pro, I think is what it was. They couldn't get in it sounds to me like the Dakota County Electronic Crimes Unit couldn't get the password to get into that machine. Is that correct, Greg?
Yes, that is definitely correct. As far as what they've said, sure.
That would make sense that Erik Nelson couldn't get into it. It's fishy that the Electronic Crimes Unit couldn't gain access to her stuff. But
I don't believe that.
Sidra and Anju Malam were interviewed, but then later requested to be out of the film and didn't make the final cut. There's a showing in a couple of weeks here in Minneapolis when it comes to the Twin Cities Fest. One of the days shows a version called the Director's Cut that'll also be aired. Have you heard anything, either of you two, with what's going to be in the Director's Cut? Is that going to be maybe the alarm footage that was left on the editing room floor, maybe in that version?
He didn't really elaborate what would be in the Director's Cut. If somebody had a question, he would say you just have to see the Director's Cut. I felt like he was plugging the Director's Cut, and it would just be a way to make additional money.
Yeah, I think we were told by not Erik Nelson, but the other guy, Robert Erickson, I think is his name. I was told that they had too much film, so they were cutting this down to a shorter version. So I'm not really shocked that they're bringing it out. I mean, look at all the footage that they have from us that they didn't use. They probably have a ton of footage from so many people that they didn't use. It sounds like the footage is heavily focused on the friends and the family, those closest ones to him. Is that correct, Ann? Or
yes,
wrong on that?
It was the people closest to him, and I think they're really brave for speaking out. I'm not going to say anything bad about the friends or the family, but like I said, I felt like they were being exploited to a sense, and I felt like it was hard to discern if this was really their real words and their perspective, or if it was being edited, or if information was being fed to him. I mean, there was a really memorable scene where one of Kamal's friends was talking about her memories of Kamal, and she's kind of trying to figure out, some of the more difficult memories, like why Kamal pulled out of the business. She shared that they had some difficult email conversations. You could tell she hadn't made up her mind one way or the other. She was just kind of trying to make sense of things. And then Erik Nelson came in and told her off camera about the time when Sidra came up from Texas to see the family, and she was turned away. And as soon as the friend had heard that piece of information, she started breaking down. She was very teary. You could just see her saying, "Oh my God, why didn't she let her in the house?" And you got the sense that at that moment, I mean, from what was portrayed in the film, I don't know what she really, thinks and feels, but at that moment, it was like she was starting to buy the psychotic narrative now, And then there was the underlying pressure of the friends and family should believe this, and we, the audience, should believe this too. And, suspend all thinking, don't look deeper, just believe it.
Another thing, Ann, that has come up on the Justice pages on Facebook is that when this documentary was being, I think, finalized before it became shown publicly, is a lot of folks, including the neighbor Judy Prochnow and some of the members of the Gray State team, I think, remembered using the phrases, "It'll all make sense when you see the movie. That'll answer all your questions. Anything that you question about why David did this will be in the movie, and that should close all the future questions." Is that a sense when you watched that movie that it kind of brought closure to what happened and why David did this, or not?
I didn't have. I walked away feeling like we don't have the answers. It didn't answer anything to me at all.
I wonder why would they say that, though? It sounded to me like it was a very slam dunk. Like, once you see this, it'll put all of your goofy theories to rest. Once you see this, because it'll answer everything. It'll tie everything off in a nice little bow, and everything will be solved once you watch this movie. So that's not the impression you received. Instead, there was, I still don't get all the laughter in the audience.
David in the movie seemed to have kind of a quirky sense of humor, and he seemed to be original. I don't know why people are laughing. That's the only thing I can think of. I think that Erik Nelson was hoping that the bits from the electronic diary would somehow sway people to believe David was psychotic. But David was, I would like to say the movie portrayed David as almost having autism. He was portrayed as being such an unusual thinker and being so different from others that when I heard the electronic diary, it didn't sway me to believe that David did anything. I was questioning if this is just his way of speaking and his personality. Maybe he went overboard making David seem so unusual and,
Interesting. What about this electronic journal? Can you tell us anything more about how it was found or how it was discovered, or where it was located, and why it wasn't in the police reports and things like that? Did it mention anything like that as far as, we've been hearing a lot about this electronic diary, electronic journal? It was referred to as an online diary at one point, and then an online journal. And what kind of format was it, and what kind of things did David put in this journal?
That was like one of the big missing pieces in the movie that made me question the movie, actually, is there was no information whatsoever about where it was found, how they accessed it. It was just kind of something that was read once in a while, I believe, by David's father. And that, to be honest, parts of the online journal reminded me of some comments that David made on his Instagram account and maybe some of his Facebook comments. It was just very hard to make sense of the journal because you weren't given any context. And not knowing where it came from, you didn't know how to judge if it was credible, had it been altered, who had access to it, You had no information about, was it, how did they forensically evaluate this? Was it date stamped? There's just nothing. It just appears in the film and it's being read. The other reason why the online journal to me didn't seem credible is because Erik Nelson didn't seem to understand what Gray State was or why Gray State is important to the fans and the people. It seemed like he was completely misjudging Gray State. So because he had that impression, I didn't trust his interpretation of the online journal. Nelson portrayed Gray State basically as senseless violence in a movie with a lot of killing. When you sit down and you watch the documentary, the first scenes you see are images from Gray State of, Mason hacking people up. And you're watching this, and it's really shocking, and you're not given any context. So you see this, and you're just like, oh, man, this is a terrible movie. No wonder this guy did this. But you don't hear that David Crowley meant Gray State as a love story and as a human interest movie. You don't hear that the trailer was made to grab attention, and the film was much deeper. And then at other points, Eric's showing only the worst things in Gray State. He's showing scenes where David has the actor sit down, and he's showing David pointing the gun in the back of people's heads and blowing them off, or the scene in the movie. At another point, he made it look like David traumatized the child actors in Gray State by making them play the scene where the kids are ripped out of bed in the middle of the night and they have to scream, help me, help me. And David's telling the children, if you say help me, where's my mommy? I'm not going to stop filming, but if you want me to stop filming, say banana. And, it sounds innocent when I'm telling you about it, but when it's portrayed in this very intense, dark movie, it really made him look like he was subjecting children to trauma, and he didn't seem to understand the message of Gray State or why everyday people were attracted to it. I mean, most people aren't attracted to Gray State to watch senseless violence. They're watching it because there's a human interest story, and it's hitting them at a personal level, and their eyes are opening to the world around them. And he completely misjudged that. It was hard for me to believe that he could even understand David at all, or that this electronic journal, he could even read that.
And I have a question. This is Dan. Do you think, from watching it, do you think that Erik Nelson himself ever sat down and watched Gray State: The Rise? It's a 2.5-hour documentary that kind of puts everything in line and sheds light on everything that David and his project and his team was doing. That's the groundwork, I think, for everything. He certainly would have watched that documentary, I would have hoped. Do you get the sense that he even took the time to even watch that?
The Rise never came up at all. So you got a situation where he either didn't watch it, which is horrible, or he watched it and he completely discarded it, which is equally as appalling. And then you have to kind of wonder, what's the story going to come out in the director's cut? The Rise was not mentioned at all. I mean, wasn't included.
Did they do any interviews from the?
Odd.
Oh, right? Go ahead, Greg.
Just saying, that's odd that it wasn't actually mentioned. Especially, I don't know. I find that very, very odd. Why wasn't it mentioned? And are people going forward with it? And it's this documentary is definitely going to be tied to that. Are the same people that came out with the Rise, with with that movie, whoever made that after David died, are they still part of whatever is going to happen next with the whole Gray State project? But we'll get into that later. But that's very odd to me too, because it almost seems like there's two groups here forming.
And then you have to wonder too, if David is so psychotic and he's planning to release The Rise at the beginning of the year. I mean, The Rise is a very educated film, and it required a lot of thought and higher level functioning to put that film together. It's almost a college level film, very educated. If he's that psychotic, why aren't we seeing the evidence of the psychosis in The Rise? I mean, you don't flip psychosis on and off like a switch. If he's that bad off, that film should have been a hot mess.
And David came off to me as more of a perfectionist in his art, in his work, in his creativity. He was more of a perfectionist. It came off as that he was a very driven individual. Interesting. Now, did they have was there any interviews? I forgot to ask, and their daughter, Rani, went to a preschool called Cypress Montessori in nearby Burnsville, Minnesota. I'm guessing that they would have done some interviews there with little Rani's teacher or maybe the director at the school. Did any of those footage make the film?
No, the only comments from Ronnie were maybe a couple of Kamel's friends, and then Dan Jr. said a couple lines about her, but nothing from the school at all. And some of the.
What was Dan Jr.'s comment? What kind of? How did he relate to? What kind of comments did he make about little Ranny?
There was two main things he said. He admitted that he would babysit for Ronnie, and then at one point that fell through. And he said David didn't get back to him, but he just wasn't concerned about that. And he didn't think something was wrong, which I thought was kind of weird because as a daycare provider, if somebody doesn't get back to you, you immediately suspect something could possibly be wrong with a child. That's not something you usually let fall through like that. The other thing he said about Ronnie is that she had some goofy traits, and he said something to the effect of she was everything you could ever. Here it is. He said she had some goofy traits, and that she would be my dream girl. And then there was a noticeable pause, and then he said, as a dad, which totally creeped me out. I mean, it just did.
Now, you follow the justice pages, correct, to some extent?
Yes.
You remember about a year ago when one of the cousins came out forward and mentioned, kind of blew the whistle on something that Dan Jr. did in the youth camp, sexually with an underage boy, and that caused the family to basically up and leave. And they got problems with him going way back to youth camp at a youth camp, something with youth kids and stuff. So was it awkward at all with him babysitting the daughter at all? But I do find it strange that, like you said, that comment does seem to be quite awkward.
It wasn't just a comment, it was the noticeable pause. So I wrote down what he said. It says here, Ronnie was what every parent would want in a daughter. She had some goofy features. There is so much to love about her. She would be my dream girl. And it was like a noticeable pause, a couple minutes, and then said, as a dad. I mean, the pause was what made it creepy. If he had just said it and you moved to the next subject, the pause is what really drew your attention to it.
Wow, that's very strange. How about the sister? Now, Allison, was she in it at all? Allison, David's sister, was she mentioned?
She was not mentioned in this one at all. They had some quotes from his dad. Like I said, reading the electronic journal, the dad was very emotional, understandably, and didn't say too much personally. They had some quotes from Mitch Hyo, Adam Shambor, Sean Wright, Dan Mason, I believe a commander that served with David in the service, and some friends of, like one friend I believe that was Kamel's friend. And then they prominently featured footage of Paleo for some reason. But like I said, the whole narrative was David was abusive and psychotic, so it was hard to determine if the friends really felt this way or what point did they believe this. I mean, there really wasn't a lot of context there. And then they had a small clip also of Judy and Colin talking about when the bodies were found, but they weren't featured very much in the movie at all other than that. In fact, the movie generally seemed to brush over when the bodies were found, the deaths, what happened, the type of injuries. None of that was really explained. It was kind of creepy, too, that Erik Nelson was basically saying David orchestrated this murder. He planned well in advance to do this, and he was picked out every detail down to the music that would be played when he would kill his family. And this was all part of his, Gray State plot. And the creepiest thing Erik Nelson said was strangely, David filmed so much of his life, but he didn't film the deaths of his family. I mean, it creeped me out, and it just really offended me. I just thought it was really insensitive and inappropriate.
Did others, do you think, got the same feeling? Were others in attendance watching this film offended or taking offense at some of this, or were they taking it in, just letting it soak in and watch it, or was it more of a film that if you didn't know the story, you left the theater believing that David was the bad guy?
People were invited to stay after the theater and talk amongst themselves. Nobody did. People left in large groups before the Q&A started, or they left immediately after the film. Some of the comments I heard that was, I didn't like the film, it was sad, and I think other people are just kind of trying to take in what they saw.
And was there anybody who left before the film was over?
No, not too much. It's a small, close-spirit theater, so you would have pretty much known if somebody left. And I think, too, the difference is, like, this film is shown at the Walker Art Center, so you have people who are used to intellectual and cultural and artsy films, so they're searching for meaning in the film and trying to see the artist's vision than an average movie-going crowd.
That's funny. So how many people can this place fit?
I'm guessing it maybe was 150 or so people.
There are 150 people there, or 150
yeah, about 150 people there.
Okay. Was it full?
It was about full, yeah.
Okay.
A lot of young people there. I would say a lot of students predominantly.
Interesting.
And it was interesting too because during the Q&A, Erik introduced people that were there as part of the Gray State team. He actually asked if Dan was there, and he kind of gave pause and was looking around. But after the film was over, people from the audience didn't seek out the Gray State team or ask questions or try to talk with them or anything. People were just pretty much up and leaving.
Did he? I'm sorry, Ann, I missed that last part. Did he ask for me?
Yeah, he asked for you. He mentioned you by name, and he kind of paused and looked around the audience to see if Dan was sitting in the audience.
That's odd. But he knows I'm not part of the Gray State team, correct?
Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious because he basically said that you're narrow-minded and you're never going to look into a psychosis theory or ever accept it, and he basically portrayed you as a conspiracy theory nutcase. It was kind of like me against you kind of mentality.
What a douchebag.
It was openly hostile, I would say that.
That guy's a douchebag because he doesn't even put any of the stuff that Dan said in there. And then he's going to say something like that. Well, then back it up, buddy. That guy's a douche. Sorry.
How about the others now? Did they, was it, for people that were there, like you said, Judy and Colin were there, was there a special spot for the Gray State people to sit, or the neighbors or something to sit, or did you just know who they were, or did they wear name tags? How did you know who was who of the people there featured, I guess? Like the family, did the family sit in a certain spot?
See any family members. Judy and Colin were sitting in the audience by themselves. In the front row, there were no name tags for some of the team members. There was Red Hat. There was Sean Wright, Mitch Heil, and Mason Hendricks was the ones I noticed. And they just pretty much sat in the front row.
And they were all sitting together?
Yeah, they were sitting together. I just had this feeling that Mitch Heil was kind of sitting, he seemed kind of aloof, apart from the rest of them, but he kind of seemed to sit with them because they were all commenting during Q&A, so that would be convenient to sit next to them. But during the film screening, it just seemed like he was apart from them. And I was actually impressed by Mitch Heil because it seemed like he was still questioning and he still had some thoughts. It didn't seem like he was necessarily buying or not buying it. It seemed like he was still trying to figure out. And some of his comments, I thought Mikhail's comments really added a lot to the Q&A, in that his insight was really important because you weren't hearing it from any other source. So I thought it was great that he spoke up when he did. He spoke up that he felt David did not have PTSD. He described his work with David in the bullet exchange and basically said he showed, in all of his years of knowing him, he showed no signs of PTSD. And then when Erik tried to say again that David's psychotic, you can see it in his script. It was disorganized. It's not how you traditionally write a script. Mitch spoke up and said that's just how David writes. It's normal for him, and it was my job to interpret it. So I thought that was good. He was giving some context.
Did they try to push the PTSD angle again in this film, or was it more psychosis, or was it more like mental illness, or was it demon possession? What type of angle did you take away from it the most that they were trying to blame for all this happening?
They were trying to throw everything in the kitchen sink that you could think of and just trying to make him look like he was all unstable. I mean, every theory basically was being thrown out. And then it was important to note, too, that Erik Nelson had a friend that was a psychiatrist, and that's who he consulted on the film, was somebody he knew personally to push the psychosis narrative. So you're not getting a neutral, unbiased professional. You're basically getting a hired gun.
So he thinks that legitimately David could have suffered from all of these things? He can't be serious.
Okay, well, they didn't. Erik Nelson, when people had questions that he couldn't answer, he would just say stuff like, "Oh, there's just answers we're never going to know," or he would say, like, "You'll just have to see the rest in my director's edition." So he didn't answer. He was very evasive.
The director's edition. This should show everything. The other cut should just add more to it, right? You shouldn't have to see that to actually try to understand anything. I don't know. Sounds weird to me.
For the military.
The whole thing was very bizarre, it sounds to me.
But it's very, I'm looking at it with a critical eye. It's a very emotional and compelling film. I mean, I could see that would be easy for somebody to get swept away by the emotion and just not think deeper or not question. I would say, too, for the military PTSD angle, they basically had, I don't know if David's commander really believes this or not. It was hard to tell what he believes, but it basically said that he fell in love with Kamal. He was unhappy about being deployed, and that the stop-loss changed him and made him bitter towards the military. And that was the narrative that was used to push that he has PTSD, or he suffered some kind of breakdown at that point in his life. And that was, to me, very offensive, too, because you have a civilian portraying this. This is not somebody who's had military service, who had personally had this experience. I don't think it's fair to judge if you haven't been through that and you haven't been through that experience and the pressures and the horrors that he went through in war and going through stop loss. I felt like looking at that from an outside perspective just wasn't enough.
Wow. Well, interesting stuff. I'm glad you took some good notes on it, because it's very interesting. Bizarre. I think the word would be bizarre, because it's very different than I guess what I had imagined, or it would be like. But wow, interesting. Well, maybe the demographic then is for the sheeple to see this, because if you're not going to watch it with an open mind, you're just going to go there and take it in as a movie. It might do well in the theaters. Who knows? Maybe the demographic, the focus here is for the American sheeple to see this.
Well, were there people like that there, or was it? I mean, what was the whole demographic like there? You said it was very young people. I would hope that the younger people would actually be willing to ask more questions about stuff like this.
Well, I think, too, if you're in a movie theater and you're being pressured that if you think outside the box, you're mentally ill. If you think outside the box, you're a conspiracy theorist. You're a violent individual. You don't fit in. There were so many of those kind of pressures. Or just having the pressure and the peer pressure and being filled with these images like, if you think outside the box, you could wind up like David Crowley. It actually encourages people not to think deeper, not to question.
Did you sense I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase the Hegelian dialectic, but was it more or less pushing that everything has got two answers, it's either one or something else, there's no third option, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, is it more like that you left the theater with this director of the movie essentially doing the mind control on the viewer? You're left there buying into this whole story. Because I've read some interviews where it says that he's throwing it all out there, Erik Nelson has said, and he really wants the audience to leave the movie and then come to their own conclusions. But it sounds like the conclusions are being really drawn, set up, served up on a silver platter by the director to what answer you should leave thinking. It's a mind control movie almost.
I felt like it was a mind control movie. I mean, there really wasn't any other conclusion to the movie than he's psychotic. And then the other conclusion was, if you think differently, then you must be part of those conspiracy theorists over there. And
wow.
It was even very negative towards the premises of Gray State. Gray State was portrayed as a very dark and violent film created by a guy with a disturbed mind. I mean, I just felt like it was even negative towards Gray State fans.
Was there, speaking of the audience, I know that the other filmings at film festivals, you'll have to buy tickets and, select the film you're going to go to and go and watch it, whereas this was just a free screening. So this may have brought in just people walking down the street. It may have brought in just members at the Walker Arts Center that would just had an opportunity to see a free film. It wasn't necessarily people coming in holding banners and saying, "Here, we're here from the Gray State because we support Gray State and we're big fans. We're here to see this movie." It kind of just brought in whoever was available at the time, walking by perhaps, to come and see this movie and probably didn't know what it all that even entailed.
Yeah, it had a wide mix in that way too. But the other thing that was shown in negative light in the movie, they had footage of Alex Jones that was shown in negative light. Paul Fest shown in a negative light. They had looked like scenes where people were protesting in the streets, and it just seemed like anybody who questioned outside of the norm was viewed as a problem, was viewed as, mentally ill. And I had a big problem with that, because if you don't understand the message of Gray State and why it's important, then you can't even remotely understand what David Crowley was about. It's like you're interpreting him from your own perspective and not taking the time to understand his perspective or what the people around him supported.
Wow. Very interesting. It sounds to me like a propaganda piece that they're trying to push the narrative and to the masses that all these people who are nut jobs. It sounds to me like it's a propaganda push. Wow.
And there was just so much information not included that was so important. Like you touched on, it didn't give any context to Danny August Mason signing away his actor's rights. And like you said, never getting back to the attorney, but less than 4 months after the deaths of David and family, now Danny is seeking copyright to Gray State. I mean, there was just so much missing from there, and you couldn't judge how credible this film is because so much was not included.
Was the attorney Adam Gislason interviewed for this documentary? That was David's attorney.
I think he was mentioned during Q&A. I don't recall seeing him on set. at all. He was mentioned during Q&A when they touched on that he was negotiating David's Hollywood deal with the film. There was here it is. Okay. Here's what my note said. There is a terms of the deal with the Hollywood producers for the Gray State script, and Adam Gisselson was facilitating it. He was described. Erik Nelson described him as an unsung hero, and he said that there was real money on the table, $25K on a $250 option, and they were going to take the film to other guys to push for more money to complete the film. That was all that was said about him.
So they mentioned the part about wheeling and dealing about the rights of the movie, but not in the last month of his life. David's correspondence back and forth to Adam Gisselson about not hearing back from Danny August Mason to give up his rights. Was that mentioned? That was a very big part of the last weeks of David's life, was working with that attorney to get this form signed by Danny August Mason. That wasn't touched on or elaborated on?
It wasn't elaborated at all. There was a little part about Danny saying that he was asked to sign away his rights, and that wasn't something he was going to do. But that was followed up by a scene of David's dad reading the electronic diary, and it said something to the effect of, "I must destroy Danny Mason now." And his dad paused and kind of laughed a little bit, and he goes, "I think that's just David being David." But if you put the two together, ask to sign away your rights, destroy Danny now, I mean, it's very misleading.
There's another comment that was made in the I think it was in the documentary, that the father touches on, and I think he says, "I must destroy my best friend." And they said that was him making a pact to kill his wife, because Comel was his best friend, and that was how out of touch he was, because David made that quote, "I need to destroy my best friend." But that wasn't Comel. People thought it was talking about Comel, but that was Danny August Mason. I mean, he needed to destroy him. He was after him, and Danny August Mason was not going to budge. That's why he had to get legal involved. Does the father just kind of laugh that off as just a snide remark?
I don't think from what I could tell, I don't think the father really understood that context. I think he just thought that was kind of David's way of talking. The other thing that really wasn't mentioned in the film that was a huge question to me, they had the father on, but they never brought up or discussed why the father left that money at the door. They never discussed how he was supporting the family, what his relationship with David was, what his relationship with the film is. They never talked about what happened with Gray State after the family's death. I mean, there's just so many gaps.
Yeah, you're right. For the listeners out there, there was a $14,000 check written by Dan Crowley Sr. Around Christmas time to David Crowley, and we don't know why that was, just to help fund help with money payments or not. That was, I think, at that point, the highest allowable tax deduction, I think, as a gift to a family member, was the maximum annually is $14,000. So I think at the end of the tax year, end of the calendar year, is why he cut that check to him to get another tax break potentially in the form of a gift. But David never cashed it. That was sitting there on the stoops in January, along with the mail. Interesting.
I found where I had that electronic journal. It was from 9/8/2014, and I believe Dan Sr. was reading in it. And it says here, "I must destroy Danny Mason or convert to the cause, and or destroy him." And his dad said, "It sounds worse than it really is. I think David is just being creative. I think."
Wow. Well, that certainly is not the case. Those guys were at odds in October, and in November, and then December 7th was the last correspondence when David asks Danny August Mason via an email, I still haven't heard your answer yet. What is it going to be? When are you going to get back in touch? And that's when I think Danny August Mason says, I need to run it by my attorney. I need to run it by my attorney first. But it sounds like in the film, Danny August Mason didn't really have to run it by anybody. His answer was no to begin with. There's no way I'm going to give up my rights.
Well, right, and they never talked about Danny's background or his history or what drew him to the film. I mean, Danny was very ambitious and had his own ideals for making a film before he even met David. I mean, he probably took this very personally, like this was his film. You know, none of that was elaborated on.
Here's another question, and I want to, the various articles and reviews I've been reading so far of the documentary. It shows one man's, collapse and fall into, and then a bunch of people thinking that the government killed him. And Greg, he can speak for himself, but I think we're kind of on the same page that I don't think we've ever came forward to say that the government killed anybody. We just think, and I believe that there's no way that David Crowley did it. There's no evidence that shows that he did it. I don't know who did. I don't know what group of people or what faction or what three-letter alphabet agency but I certainly you'd be certainly bringing in Danny August Mason as a suspect along with some of these other characters in the film, in the project, as suspects to be looked at, interviewed, and then thus later on eliminated as suspects, but authorities never did that. And one of those key people that we're talking motive here is Danny August Mason. So for the father to laugh that off, to say that I think he was just joking, it wasn't much more than I think it was. That's a strange. I can't believe he'd be that naive to say that, but I've never met the man, so I don't know.
Well, and that's a good point too, Dan, because everybody goes through bumps in their marriage or difficult times. David wasn't a perfect person. He might have had his difficulties, but even so, the preponderance of the evidence shows that the official story is not holding weight, that there is more that happened here, and those questions have not been answered. So think what you want to about David. Those are opinions. We're talking about factual forensic evidence. We're talking about tangible things that have been recorded, and none of that was addressed in this film, and so far none of it has been directly addressed by the team.
Wow, so it sounds like it's mainly, there's not a lot of, it's a lot of, I don't want to say opinions in the movie. I mean, it's actually facts, but it sounds like it's cherry-picked video footage and clips and scenes that are cherry-picked, all shedding David Crowley in a negative light.
David Crowley is abusive and psychotic, and using emotional imagery to do so, using violence to shock the viewer, and then using the interviews from friends and families to pressure people, but you don't know if that's really what the friends and family really believe, because this film just seems to be one giant manipulation, and it's gotten so many things wrong. How are you supposed to believe this?
Did the Q&A, did that kind of show that everybody, all of those people, all the Gray State team people, that they were all kind of on the same page, that they all liked this movie?
That to me was very difficult to watch, is the Q&A, because this family was horrifically killed. Like Mason standing there taking pictures of the audience, acting like he's the big man, and where's the emotion? Where's the tears? How can you do this? I really struggled with that. I mean, they didn't break down. They didn't. The only one that really showed emotion, I would say, was Mitch. But it was just so cavalier. Like, this was their film premiere. This was their race date. And I just really struggled with the lack of emotion and the lack of connection to David.
Did you say Mason Hendricks was taking pictures?
He was taking pictures of the audience. He was acting like, well, he's listed on the credits as a co-producer, but he was there taking pictures and acting like this is his film premiere. I mean, it was his big moment. And I really struggled with that. I mean, this is a horrific tragedy. These are supposed to be your close friends. How, I mean, there have been people who have been killed that are close to you that you can't even talk about what had happened, and this hasn't been that long. How do you move on so quickly and profit from their deaths and make this movie and then basically defame the people that have supported you? This movie is defamation of the Gray State fans. It's defamation of the Liberty Movement. It's defamation of any free-thinking American citizen. I just had a huge problem with that.
Almost like they were proud and movie star-ish kind of a...
It looks like this was their Gray State. That's the impression I got.
Oh my God. And that is very creepy. This is not an action-packed feature film that you're proud of, and this is not the red carpet that you're going to be waving at fans and smiling and taking pictures. This is a documentary about a massacre. Did you understand that?
It looked like business as usual. I mean, I can't even compare the loss that I've experienced, for example, having a grandma pass away. When I talk about my grandma, my voice still gets wavery, my eyes tear up. You're talking about intimate, personal memories that people are confiding in you about, somebody they love and care about. A whole family was murdered, and no sign of emotion. It's business as usual. We're going to promote this. I couldn't understand that on a human level. I did understand the lack of emotion.
Wow. All right. Anything else? Any other questions, Greg?
No, I think we covered a lot. Is there anything else that people should know before they go and see this movie?
I would just say, if you see this movie, go in with an open mind and be willing to think and question for yourself and look deeper for the answers. Just because this is on a film and it's put together in a very glitzy way doesn't make any of it true or accurate. So don't be afraid to look deeper and seek out the story and look for the answers yourself.
Very well put. All right, well, Ann, thank you for your input. I've got nothing else really to share, I guess, other than kind of a sick pit in my stomach, but oh well. All right, anything else, Greg?
Nope, I think that's it.
All right. All right, so for the viewers out there, please listen to this. Comment on the bottom when we post this on the web. Feel free to comment below with questions and anything that we may have missed.